This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you want to pre-order Wilds of Eldraine, you can use my link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsahone, and it's time for another Wilds of Eldraine set review video. So far I've looked at every single card in the main set, but we still have to look at the set's bonus sheet, which is called Enchanted Tales. A bonus sheet is a subset of reprints that appear in a special slot in each draft booster. We've seen them in the past with Strixhaven's Mystical Archive and March of the Machine's Multiverse Legends, for example. This time around, the bonus sheet consists entirely of enchantments. There are 63 of them in all, and we'll look at all of them in this video. For each of these cards, I'll discuss how I think they'll play in Limited, and I'll sum up my thoughts by using a letter grade. If you're new to my set reviews, you can find out what my grades mean by looking in the description. One thing to keep in mind is that I'm only talking about these cards for Limited. There are a lot of cards on this bonus sheet that are super important in other Magic formats, but a lot of them are also completely terrible in Limited, so it's important I tell you that. Unlike most set review videos, this one is made up entirely of reprints, so I have played with many of these cards in Limited before, but every format is different, so my opinions on these cards may change over time, and that's something I'll be sharing on the channel as we move forward. Lastly, I want to let you know that I'm offering some set review related perks for both patrons and channel members. You get access to my ongoing notes during preview season, and by the end of the set review, which is today, you'll have a spreadsheet with all of my grades. If those perks sound interesting to you and you want to support the channel, you can find ways to become a channel member or a patron in the description. Alright, without further ado, let's look at the first card in Enchanted Tales. And that card is Blind Obedience, which for 1 generic and a white is a rare enchantment with Extort. That means whenever you cast it, you can pay a hybrid black-white mana. If you do, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain that much life. Artifacts and creatures your opponents control enter the battlefield tapped. Adding a 1-mana kicker to all of your stuff that lets you drain 1 life is a pretty useful thing. Making your opponent's stuff enter tapped is less good, as it's something that usually only matters if you're the beatdown. However, the two things do combine fairly nicely together, since draining 1 life will pressure your opponent, and the new things they play won't be able to block your creatures. Even nerfing food and treasure is going to come up sometimes. This looks pretty good overall, giving it a B-. Next up, it's Dawn of Hope, which for 1 generic and a white is a rare enchantment. Whenever you gain life, you can pay 2 generic. If you do, draw a card, and you can pay 3 generic and a white and make a 1/1 white soldier creature token with lifelink. This was pretty good last time we saw it. Cranking out 1/1s with lifelink and being able to draw cards off of them is nice, and the addition of food in this format means that gaining life isn't that difficult. This definitely has potential to be quite the engine, though it can be a little slow to get going, giving it a B. Next up, it's Grasp of Fate, which for 1 generic and 2 white is an uncommon enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, for each opponent, exile up to 1 target non-land permanent that player controls until Grasp of Fate leaves the battlefield. So this is an Oblivion Ring variant, and like all of them, it's great premium removal. Hitting multiple permanent types and exiling for 3 is just really good. There's a risk it gets destroyed, of course, but that doesn't make it any less impressive, giving it a B. Next up, it's Greater Mancy, which for 1 generic and a white is a mythic rare enchantment. Other enchantments you control have Shroud. This isn't a keyword we see very often today, so I'll read the reminder text. A permanent with Shroud can't be the target of spells or abilities. Enchanted creatures you control have Shroud. So, giving all of your enchanted creatures Shroud is intriguing, since auras are so easily available in this format, but this is still an enchantment that does pretty much nothing on its own, and things just won't always line up for it to do something, even in this format. It's probably playable in the right deck, but it's not something that makes the cut all the time. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Griffin Airy, which for 1 generic and a white is an uncommon enchantment. At the beginning of your end step, if you gain 3 or more life this turn, create a 2/2 white Griffin creature token with flying. This has the potential to be pretty good, at least in some decks. Food isn't that readily available in white, but if you're paired with black or green, you're going to have some food, and this basically adds make a 2/2 flying token to your food getting sacrificed, and that's kind of insane. There are many other ways to gain life in white too, of course, but that's the one that immediately springs to mind when you see a card that has a threshold of 3 life for it to do something. It needs a build around grade, since not all white decks will trigger it enough, but I think this can make a whole lot of tokens in the right deck, but it probably is an F in your typical white deck, but it probably has a ceiling of a B-. Next up, it's Intangible Virtue, which for 1 generic and a white is an uncommon enchantment. Creature tokens you control get +1/+1 and have Vigilance. There are enough tokens in this set for this to be good in the right deck. Rat tokens are probably the most plentiful, and if you're pairing white with black or red, you're likely to have some of those, in addition to night tokens, bird tokens, and human tokens. This is another one that needs a build around, because if you don't have a critical mass of tokens, it's awful, as in an F. If you do end up with like 10 cards that make tokens, it's probably a B. Next up, it's Karmic Justice, which for 2 generic and a white is a rare enchantment. Whenever a spell or ability an opponent controls destroys a non-creature permanent you control, you may destroy a target permanent that opponent controls. Your opponent isn't going to be destroying your non-creature permanents often enough for this to matter in Limited. It's an F. Next up, it's Knightly Valor, which for 4 generic and a white is an uncommon enchantment aura with enchant creature. When it enters the battlefield, create a 2/2 white knight creature token with vigilance. Enchanted creature gets +2/+2 and has vigilance. I've liked this aura every time we've seen it. This is because it adds a body to the board, in addition to offering a fairly significant buff. Because of that body, this aura helps you get around the inherent downside that auras have, as it becomes a lot harder for you to get 2 for 1 when the aura gives you a token, giving this a C+. Next up, it's Land Tax, which for 1 white mana is a mythic rare enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, if an opponent controls more lands than you may search your library for up to 3 basic land cards, reveal them, put them into your hand, and then shuffle. This can be pretty powerful. After all, it can draw you 3 cards a turn. Sure, those cards are all lands, but cards are cards. Getting all the lands out of your deck has its benefits too, of course. This can even offer fixing to a white deck since it can grab any basic land. Of course, if you get this late and have more lands than your opponent, it basically does nothing. So this card is wildly inconsistent. There will be games where having it in your hand is like you mulliganed, and then there will be games where it's a value engine. In the end, it's probably just a C. Next up, it's Leyline of Sanctity, which for 2 generic and 2 white is a rare enchantment. If it's in your opening hand, you may begin the game with it on the battlefield. You have hexproof. Giving yourself hexproof almost never matters in Limited. This is an F. Next up, it's Phyrexian Unlife, which for 2 generic and a white is a rare enchantment. You don't lose the game for having 0 or less life. As long as you have 0 or less life, all damage is dealt to you as though its source had infect. So you can use this to give yourself more life to work with, but the main problem with that is that if you're dropped to 0 life for some reason and your solution to that problem is Phyrexian Unlife, well, you probably didn't really deal with whatever your actual problem is, so you're likely to get poisoned to death. It's just like a card that gains you a bunch of life and doesn't do anything else. It's just sort of a more complicated way of doing it. It's an F. Next up, it's Rest in Peace, which for 1 generic and a white is a rare enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, exile all graveyards. If a card or token would be put into a graveyard from anywhere, exile it instead. This isn't a format with a heavy enough graveyard theme where you want to use up an entire card just to hate on the graveyard. It's an F. Next up, it's Smothering Tithe, which for 3 generic and a white is a mythic rare enchantment. Whenever an opponent draws a card, that player may pay 2 generic. If the player doesn't, you create a treasure token. It's probably hard for Commander players to believe, but this was awful last time we saw it in Limited. I mean, even if this just spat out a treasure every single turn, it wouldn't actually be that good in a format where mana kind of loses its meaning by the late game, and this is worse than that in most ways. It's an F. Next up, it's As Foretold, which for 2 generic and a blue is a rare enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, put a time counter on As Foretold. Once each turn, you can pay 0 mana rather than pay the mana cost for a spell you cast, with mana value X or less, where X is the number of time counters on As Foretold. This is another really bad Limited card. You just can't count on lining things up right with this to ever cast free spells. It's an F. Next up, it's Compulsion, which for 1 generic and a blue is a rare enchantment. You can pay 1 generic and a blue and discard a card to draw a card, and you can pay 1 generic and a blue and sacrifice Compulsion to draw a card. This isn't great. Rummaging can be nice, but having to pay mana to do it is a big downside, and even though this can replace itself, you have to invest 4 mana to get there. I'm giving it a D. Next, there's Copy Enchantment. This is 2 generic and a blue for an enchantment, and when it enters the battlefield, it enters as a copy of another enchantment on the battlefield. There are enough enchantments in this format for this to have a reasonable target pretty often. Obviously, copying an aura token isn't exactly ideal, but that will be the fail case, and oftentimes you'll be able to copy something that's actually meaningful, giving this a C+. Next, it's Curiosity, which for 1 blue mana is an uncommon enchantment aura with enchant creature. Whenever enchanted creature deals damage to an opponent, you may draw a card. For this to do anything, the creature you put it on generally already has to be good and likely to get in for damage, otherwise it's meaningless. And when an aura needs that from you, it gets a lot worse. If you have a lot of flyers, maybe this isn't a bad role player, but most of the time you won't play it, giving it a D. Next up, it's Forced Fruition, which for 4 generic and 2 blue is a rare enchantment. Whenever an opponent casts a spell, that player draws 7 cards. So the idea here is to make your opponent mill themselves out before they can beat you with their overwhelming card advantage. The problem with that is, if you ever play this when you're behind or at parity, you're probably going to lose. If you play it when you're ahead, your opponent probably can't dig themselves out of milling themselves before they stabilize, but if you were already ahead, basically like a 6 mana 6/6 probably would have been even better. So this is just a big dud most of the time, giving it an F. Next up, it's Fraying Sanity, which for 2 generic and a blue is a rare enchantment or a curse with enchant player. At the beginning of each instep, enchanted player mills X cards, where X is the number of cards put into their graveyard from anywhere this turn. To make this work, you usually need some dedicated mill deck around, and there's not really one in this format this time around. We had one last time in Eldraine, but this format it's more of a sub-theme, and there just isn't enough to support this, giving it an F. Next up, it's Hatching Plans, which for 1 generic and a blue is an uncommon enchantment. When it's put into a graveyard from the battlefield, draw 3 cards. This will be one of the absolute best things you can ever sacrifice to a bargain card, as you end up netting a ton of cards in addition to getting a bonus effect. Most decks in this format will have enough cards with bargain to make this worth playing. The downside is, of course, that this card does stone nothing when you can't sacrifice it. But one of the set's core mechanics lets you sacrifice enchantments, so it's going to work out reasonably well. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Intruder Alarm, which for 2 generic and a blue is a rare enchantment. Creatures don't untap during their controller's untap steps. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield, untap all creatures. This could get interesting if this format had any creatures who can tap and make a free creature token, because that lets you go infinite, but there aren't any of those, at least at lower rarities, so mostly what you get out of this is pseudo-vigilance and a pseudo-lockdown effect, but you basically have no control over either. That makes it an F. Next up, it's Kindred Discovery, which for 3 generic and 2 blue is a mythic rare enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. Whenever a creature you control of the chosen type enters the battlefield or attacks, draw a card. This will work in a fairy deck, as if you have a critical mass of those, you're going to be drawing a ton of cards, especially because their evasiveness allows them to attack so effectively. Other blue decks in the format aren't likely to have enough creatures of a single type to make it work though, so this does need a build-around grade. It's going to be an F in most decks, but a B in a fairy deck. Next up, it's Leyline of Anticipation, which for 2 generic and 2 blue is a rare enchantment. If Leyline of Anticipation is in your opening hand, you may begin the game with it on the battlefield. You may cast spells as though they had flash. Giving all your spells flash matters some, but not so much that you want to spend an entire card on it in limited. This is an F. Next up, it's Omniscience, which for 7 generic and 3 blue is a mythic rare enchantment. You may cast spells from your hand without paying their mana costs. This is too expensive, and by the time you play it, you won't have anything to put into play for free anyway. It's an F. Next up, it's Wristic Study, which for 2 generic and a blue is a mythic rare enchantment. Whenever an opponent casts a spell, you may draw a card unless that player pays 1 generic. Unlike fellow Commander All-Star Smothering Tithe, Wristic Study isn't completely unplayable, although it's still way worse in Limited than it is in Commander. If you get it late, it won't do anything. However, playing it in the early to mid-game is likely to get you a few cards, or at least cause problems for your opponent. It's probably a C. Next up, it's Spreading Seas, which for 1 generic and a blue is an uncommon enchantment aura with Enchant Land. When it enters the battlefield, you draw a card. Enchanted Land is an island. This doesn't do much in Limited. Sure, if your opponent happens to have only one land that can produce one of their main colors and you stick this on it, it can be hilarious, but most of the time that's not going to happen. Replacing itself just isn't enough these days either. It needs to actually do something, and it just won't. It's an F. Next up, it's Bitter Blossom, which for 1 generic and a blue is a mythic rare tribal enchantment, Fairy. At the beginning of your upkeep, you lose 1 life and create a 1/1 black fairy rogue creature token with flying. This is utterly unbeatable on turn 2, and no matter when you draw it, it represents a significant threat that will allow you to really snowball your advantage. It gets even sillier if you happen to be in the fairy deck and can get some extra value out of all these tokens. This is a bomb, giving it an A. Next up, it's Dark Tutelage, which for 2 generic and a black is an uncommon enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, reveal the top card of your library and put that card into your hand. You lose life equal to its mana value. Drawing extra cards is good, but mana values get high enough in most limited decks that this might be a problem. It also doesn't add to the board at all, but if you have a really low curve, this can end up being quite the card advantage engine, but I'm skeptical you'll end up in a deck that can really use this very often, giving it a D. Next up, it's Grave Pact, which for 1 generic and 3 black is a mythic rare enchantment. Whenever a creature you control dies, each other player sacrifices a creature. This can do some pretty cool stuff, especially if you're sacrificing expendable creatures to make your opponent give up something real, and it even makes a trade into a 2-for-1 in your favor. There isn't always a board state where you can take advantage of it, like if you're behind, but it's pretty awesome at parity or if you're ahead. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Leyline of the Void, which for 2 generic and 2 black is a rare enchantment. If it's in your opening hand, you can begin the game with it on the battlefield. If a card would be put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, exile it instead. As I've already said, using up an entire card to hate on the graveyard just isn't worth it in this format. It's an F. Next up, it's Necropotence, which for 3 black mana is a mythic rare enchantment. Skip your draw step. Whenever you discard a card, exile that card from your graveyard, pay 1 life, exile the top card of your library face down, put that card into your hand at the beginning of your next end step. Drawing a ton of cards is amazing, and that's obviously what this can allow for. If you can combine it with life gain, something black has plenty of in this format in the form of food tokens, it won't even really feel like it has much of a downside, since you'll just keep drawing cards and having enough life to keep on doing it. The card advantage it grants is often insurmountable, but obviously, if you get it when you're behind, it can be kind of a dud. It still sort of gives you a puncher's chance because of all the cards you can draw, but if your life is low, obviously its usefulness is going to be very limited. The triple black cost is also surprisingly challenging and limited, but this is really good overall, giving it a B+. Next up, it's Oppression, which for 1 generic and 2 black is a rare enchantment. Whenever a player casts a spell, that player discards a card. I am not interested in a symmetrical effect that isn't actually symmetrical. You actually end up coming out behind because you spend the mana and use a card to play this in the first place. I'm giving this an F. Next up, it's Oversold Cemetery, which for 1 generic and a black is a rare enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, if you have 4 or more creature cards in your graveyard, you may return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. Getting 4 or more creatures in your graveyard isn't a huge ask by the mid to late game, and if you can use this to draw a couple of cards, you're going to feel pretty good about it. Most black decks will be creature heavy enough and graveyard oriented enough for this to deliver some real value. It can get particularly interesting with adventure creatures because some of them have removal spells and things like that attached to them, and getting those back is a lot different than getting back a creature. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's Polluted Bonds, which for 3 generic and 2 black is a rare enchantment. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under an opponent's control, that player loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. This is a powerful effect, but by the time you play this, your opponent won't really be desperate to play new lands, so you aren't putting the squeeze on them nearly as much as you might think, giving this a D. Next up, it's Sanguine Bond, which for 3 generic and 2 black is a rare enchantment. Whenever you gain life, target opponent loses that much life. There is life gain in black, but the fact that this is so expensive, doesn't add to the board at all, and does stone nothing unless you manage to draw it in the right order before you gain all of your life, all of that's a huge problem. That's why I'm giving it an F. Next up, it's Stab Wound, which costs 2 generic and a black. It's an uncommon enchantment aura with enchant creature. Enchanted creature gets -2/-2. At the beginning of the upkeep of enchanted creature's controller, that player loses 2 life. This was a nice limited card when we've seen it before, and I think it will be here. It feels good to outright kill something with it, but it feels even better to put it on a creature that doesn't die, because the aura usually does enough to make that creature irrelevant, while also allowing you to pressure your opponent's life. I'm giving this a C+. Next, it's Vampiric Rites, which for 1 black mana is an uncommon enchantment. You can pay 1 generic and a black and sacrifice a creature to gain 1 life and draw a card. This is a nice sacrifice outlet. It's really cheap to cast. The cost of the activated ability isn't bad, and black in this format has access to many rat tokens that will feel particularly good to sacrifice to this. I'm giving it a C+. Next, there's Waste Not, which for 1 generic and a black is a rare enchantment. Whenever an opponent discards a creature card, create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. Whenever an opponent discards a land card, add 2 black mana. Whenever an opponent discards a non-creature, non-land card, draw a card. You can't build a dedicated discard deck in this format, so this is an F. Next, it's Aggravated Assault, which for 2 generic and a red is a rare enchantment. For 3 generic and 2 red, it says untap all creatures you control. If it's a main phase, there is an additional combat phase followed by an additional main phase, activate only as a sorcery. Paying a total of 8 mana for an extra combat step is not a good way to win a game of Magic, at least in Limited. There will be times where you can use that extra combat step to great effect, but there will be many, many more when you have neither the time nor the mana nor the board state to actually make this matter. It's an F. Next up, it's Blood Moon, 2 generic and a red, mythic rare enchantment, non-basic lands or mountains. Not enough non-basic lands in the format, it's an F. Next up, it's Dragon Mantle, which for 1 red is an uncommon enchantment aura with enchant creature. When it enters the battlefield, you draw a card. An enchanted creature has 1 red. This creature gets +1/+0 until end of turn. Giving a creature fire breathing isn't particularly useful unless that creature was already pretty good, but this does replace itself, so that makes the floor on it pretty reasonable when it only costs 1 mana. It isn't a bad thing to sacrifice to bargain either, since it will have already given you a card. I think it's a C-. Next up, it's Fiery Emancipation, which for 3 generic and 3 red is a rare enchantment. If a source you control would deal damage to a permanent or player, it deals triple that damage to that permanent or player instead. It might look at first like this card doesn't really impact the board. You know, that's something I usually complain about a lot in limited reviews, right? But this can actually augment your board the turn you play it, since it effectively triples the power of all of your creatures. This makes them better in combat and obviously better at damaging your opponent. It even makes them much better blockers, so this isn't a complete disaster when you're behind either. If you don't have a somewhat reasonable board state, obviously it doesn't do anything, but most of the time it will do something, and sometimes it'll be absolutely backbreaking. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Goblin Bombardment, which for 1 generic and a red is a rare enchantment. Sacrifice a creature, it deals 1 damage to any target. A free sacrifice effect isn't the kind of thing we see that often today, and it's pretty powerful. If your deck has a lot of creature tokens, like rats, this has the potential to be amazing, as turning every one of your creatures into 1 damage can often turn a game on its head. However, you do need to have those creatures, meaning this doesn't do a whole lot on its own. It probably needs a build around grade because you're going to need both a really high creature count and a lot of creature tokens before this starts to approach something worthy of making your deck. It's probably going to be an F in most red decks in the format, and a C+ that really gets there on creatures. Next up, it's Impact Tremors, which for 1 generic and a red is an uncommon enchantment. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, it deals 1 damage to each opponent. Like Goblin Bombardment, if your deck can make a lot of bodies, this does represent a pretty big problem for your opponent, although it is a very awkward top deck, unlike Bombardment. Bombardment rewards you for already having things in play. Impact Tremors doesn't. It's probably a D. Next up, it's Leyline of Lightning, which for 2 generic and 2 red is a rare enchantment. If it's in your opening hand, you can begin the game with it on the battlefield. Whenever you cast a spell, you can pay 1 generic. If you do, it does 1 damage to target player or planeswalker. Like all the other Leylines, this effect isn't worth a card, so even if you put it into play for free, you're not going to really feel good about it. In fact, it will feel more like you mulliganed than anything. Having the spare mana to ping your opponent won't happen until late, and it usually won't be very meaningful. This is an F. Next up, it's Mana Flare, 2 generic and a red, rare enchantment. Whenever a player taps a land for mana, that player adds 1 mana of any type that land produced. You don't really want to double the mana of you and your opponent, especially because most of the time when you play this, your opponent will get the first crack at all that sweet, sweet mana. It's an F. Next up, it's Raid Bombardment, which for 2 generic and a red is an uncommon enchantment. Whenever a creature you control with power 2 or less attacks, it deals 1 damage to the player or planeswalker that creature is attacking. This is another enchantment that rewards you for having lots of small creatures. Things might get interesting if you can get your hands on Impact Tremors and Goblin Bombardment along with this. Anyway, like those, this really needs a specific deck. One that makes a lot of rats is the most likely in red, but if you can do that, you can quickly damage your opponent. It's probably an F in most decks and a C if you get there on small stuff. Next up, it's Repercussion, which for 1 generic and 2 red is a mythic rare enchantment. Whenever a creature is dealt damage, Repercussion deals that much damage to that creature's controller. This is another symmetrical effect that it's very hard to make sure you get the best of, so it's better to just not play it. I'm giving it an F. Next, it's Shared Animosity, which for 2 generic and a red is a rare enchantment. Whenever a creature you control attacks, it gets +1/+0 until end of turn for each other attacking creature that shares a creature type with it. This is another one of these enchantments that is interesting alongside rat tokens, as if you even just have 3 of them around, it gives them a huge upgrade. In red, you aren't that likely to have a critical mass of other creature types though, so this probably also needs a build around grade. It's going to be an F in most decks, but it has some potential in a rat token heavy deck, where it's probably a C+. Next, it's Sneak Attack, which for 3 generic and a red is a mythic rare enchantment. For 1 red, you may put a creature card from your hand onto the battlefield. That creature gains haste, sacrifice the creature at the beginning of the next end step. This is interesting. If you have some big creatures, especially with enter the battlefield abilities, sneak attacking them into play can be nuts, and there are a few of those in the format. The bad part is that most of the time sneak attacking a creature doesn't let you add to the board permanently, and if you don't have some board presence, you're probably still going to lose. So there are going to be times where it's just not beneficial for you to use this, a lot of them, actually. There's a ton of power here, clearly, but making it work in limited is going to be a little bit tricky. I think it has enough potential for me to declare it entirely unplayable, but it's hard for me to go above a C. Next up, it's Defense of the Heart, which for 3 generic and a green is a mythic rare enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, if an opponent controls 3 or more creatures, sacrifice Defense of the Heart, search your library for up to 2 creature cards, put those cards onto the battlefield, and then shuffle. If you can get this to trigger, obviously it's insane, as you get your 2 best creatures directly on the battlefield. Making it trigger isn't far-fetched either, as I would say by the mid-game, most of the time in limited, your opponent probably has 3 creatures. They can try their best to get under 3 creatures before this triggers, but if they're doing that, you're still drastically altering their game plan. It takes a whole turn to do its thing. Sometimes it won't do anything, though I think those will be few and far between, but it's still a pretty powerful 2-for-1 that can swing the game wildly in your favor. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Doubling Season. For 4 generic and a green is a mythic rare enchantment. If an effect would create 1 or more tokens under your control, it creates twice that many of those tokens instead. If an effect would put 1 or more counters on a permanent you control, it puts twice that many of those counters on that permanent instead. This format has a lot of tokens to double, but not very many counters. On its own, this is a 5-mana card that doesn't do anything, and that's always a liability. You can definitely get some sweet value out of it sometimes, but it's so slow and needs such specific cards that I think it's just a D. Next up, it's Garrick's Uprising, which for 2 generic and a green is an uncommon enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, you draw a card. Creatures you control have trample. Whenever a creature with power 4 or greater enters the battlefield under your control, draw a card. The red-green and blue-green decks in this format can probably make decent use of this. One of the nice things about it is that it rewards you some for already having something big in play, and then rewards you as well when you play them afterwards. That kind of payoff is always more attractive than one that only does one or the other for obvious reasons. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Ground Seal, which for 1 generic and a green is an uncommon enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, draw a card. Cards in graveyards can't be the targets of spells or abilities. So unlike the other graveyard hate things we've seen, this does replace itself, so you don't actually end up using a whole card to hate on the graveyard, but it's still kind of a do-nothing card that there's really no reason for you to play, so I think it's still an F. Next up, it's Hardened Scales. For 1 green, it's a rare enchantment. If 1 or more +1/+1 counters would be put on a creature you control, put that many +1/+1 counters on it instead. There aren't enough +1/+1 counters in this format for this to even work as a build-around. It's an F. Next, it's Leyline of Abundance, which for 2 generic and 2 green is a rare enchantment. If it's in your opening hand, you can begin the game with it on the battlefield. Whenever you tap a creature for mana, add an additional green, and for 6 generic and 2 green, you can put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. This format does have a few creatures who can tap for mana, but not enough to make this card worth it. It isn't worth just having access to this activated ability either. Most of the time, this just won't do anything. It's an F. Next up, it's Nature's Will, which for 2 generic and 2 green is a rare enchantment. Whenever 1 or more creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, tap all lands that player controls and untap all lands you control. This triggering often won't do anything to your opponent or help you cast anything. If you play it on turn 4, there is a chance it will help you double spell or something that turn, but its usefulness quickly dissipates the longer the game goes on, giving it an F. Next up, it's Parallel Lives, which for 3 generic and a green is a mythic rare enchantment. If an effect would create 1 or more tokens under your control, it creates twice that many of those tokens instead. There are a lot of tokens in this format, so this probably has some potential. Like a lot of the cards in this video, though, it doesn't really do anything on its own, and that's always going to hurt a card significantly. I think this is a C. Next, it's Primal Vigor, which for 4 generic and a green is a rare enchantment. If 1 or more tokens would be created, twice that many of those tokens are created instead. If 1 or more +1/+1 counters would be put on a creature, twice that many +1/+1 counters are put on that creature instead. It's kind of weird that they have this and Doubling Season in the same set. I mean, they aren't identical, but close enough. And like Doubling Season, this has some serious power, but the +1/+1 counterpart isn't going to do a whole lot, so you're really reliant on having a bunch of tokens, which is far from a guarantee. I'm giving this a D. Next, there's Prismatic Omen, which for 1 generic and a green is a rare enchantment. Lands you control are every basic land type in addition to their other types. If you need fixing, you can do a lot worse than this as it makes your mana pretty much perfect. You aren't always in the market for fixing, of course, but if you are, this works pretty nicely. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Season of Growth, which for 1 generic and a green is an uncommon enchantment. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, scry 1. Whenever you cast a spell that targets a creature you control, draw a card. The scry effect alone isn't enough to run this, and it wasn't last time, but the good news is there are several green cards in the set that will trigger this even at lower rarities. There are combat tricks, of course, but this also works really well with all the fight and bite spells. And there's 2 of those at uncommon and 1 at common, and it'll make all of them into 2-for-1s, which is pretty nuts. So I think you can actually play one of these in most green decks and have it do something, and in some of them it might even be nuts. I'm giving it a C. Next, there's Unnatural Growth, which for 1 generic and 4 green is a rare enchantment. At the beginning of each combat, double the power and toughness of each creature you control until end of turn. This works during both players' combats, and as long as you have some creatures, it's going to drastically upgrade your board, often allowing you to swing for massive amounts of damage, or if you're behind, suddenly your small creatures can tangle with theirs. It was pretty good when we saw it last time. The biggest problem is that it costs 4 green and demands you have a board state, but it is still pretty powerful. I'm giving it a B. Last, there is Utopia Sprawl, which for 1 green is an uncommon enchantment aura with Enchant Forest. When it enters the battlefield, choose a color. Whenever Enchanted Forest is tapped for mana, its controller adds an additional 1 mana of the chosen color. This offers nice fixing and ramp at a very efficient rate. It lets you play 3 mana things on turn 2, which is always a big deal in Limited. It does only enchant forests, which comes up sometimes, but this is still a pretty great way to get a mana advantage early. It does get worse later in the game when mana is less meaningful, but one cool thing about that in this format is that you can just bargain this away when it doesn't matter anymore. And the early game power it has is definitely enough for it to be a C+. So that's the last card in Enchanted Tales and the last card in the Wilds of Eldraine limited set review. However, there's lots more limited content coming, including an archetype guide, draft videos, and updates about the format. If you want to make sure you catch all of those, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on the set review, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. And if you want to go the extra mile in supporting me and the channel, you can become a channel member or a patron. You can find ways to do those things in the description. Thanks for watching.